Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this ENSPOR webinar dedicated to monitoring and verification linked to all the support scheme for energy efficiency related to Article 7 of the Energy Efficiency Directive. My name is Dario Di Santo. I'm the Managing Director of FIRE, the Italian Federation for Energy Efficiency, and I will chair this webinar and stay with you for all this webinar that will last more or less 1.5 hours or 2 hours. You are free to make questions during the presentations by using the dedicated question tab in your control panel. So feel free to ask questions to the speakers, because the more interactive the session, the more interesting is both for us and for you. I'll say 2 words about both FIRE and the ENSPOR project, and then we'll go through the different speeches for today. There are 4. The first one from Mia Dragovic about the Multi project and the Croatian experience. Then there will be Nina Pica with the Austrian experience, Frank Hems with the United Kingdom experience, and last the Britannia experience that I will tell you to close the 4 speeches. After that, there will be another time for discussion, so if you haven't asked a question during the speech, you will be able to do it at that moment. So, FIRE is an association founded in 1987 with the aim of promoting energy efficiency and sustainability. We manage, on behalf of the Ministry of Economic Development, an Italian Energy Manager Network since 1992, since in Italy there is an obligation for large consumers to appoint every year an energy manager, and we have more or less 450 members that covers all the energy sector, from power producers, technology producers, utility ESCOs, and end users. And half of them are organization, the other half are professionals and practitioners that works in these sectors. We are active in information dissemination, training, and also in implementing market studies in the energy sector. We are involved in many European projects, presently ESPOL, that will be concluded in a month, that deals with energy policies, of course. The EU Mercy project that started just a few months ago, dealing with good practices in the industrial sector for energy efficiency, of course. The SME Energy Checkup project, dealing with a self-audit tool and audits and implementation of energy efficiency project for small enterprises. And last, on behalf of INEA, we manage the core team on energy audits and energy services in the concerted action for the Energy Efficiency Directive. So, 2 words about the ENSPOR project. It started 3 years ago, and it will end by the end of August. Its specific objects were to assess the strength and weaknesses of existing energy efficiency obligations and alternative measure schemes existing in Europe, and also to give recommendations to policymakers and to managing agencies to improve the existing schemes, or to set up new schemes considering the request of Article 7 of the Energy Efficiency Directive. Of course, it was related to engaging the stakeholders of all levels that can contribute to this task, and to put together, both at local level and at the European level, of the relevant stakeholders. In terms of consortium, as you can see, more or less half of the European countries were represented, and anyway, the ESPOR project was able to cover all the European member states in terms of reports, analysis of the situation, and actions. In particular, one of the deliverables of the project is the platform about Article 7 that can be found at the article7eed.eu link website, and it contains all the information available on existing schemes, both energy efficiency obligation and alternative measures, and can be navigated also with respect to particular topics, for example, additionality or how to evaluate the savings and so on. So you can both compare different countries in terms of these particular aspects, or you can have a look on a particular country, on a particular scheme, and go into the details of that scheme. One of the important features of this platform is the possibility to contribute to the contents. So please have a look at that if you are interested in these topics of energy efficiency support schemes, and feel free to contribute, to send us a suggestion or information, data that can be helpful to improve the contents of the platform. Among the other interesting links related to the project, there is the global website, of course, jansport.eu, in which you can find both all the reports implemented for all the European member states under the menu results. And you can also find under the menu events all the proceedings related to the conferences and webinars that we have organized during the years. By the way, this is our 7th and last webinar. Webinars were not provided by the contract agreement, but the consortium decided to provide also webinars in addition to all the other events, national observatories, EU observatories, and initiatives that we created over these 3 years in order to give another possibility for the stakeholders to get useful information, ask experts for advice, and also create a network for exchanging information. So this is what I would say about the project. I remind you the possibility to ask questions both during the presentations and at the end of the 4 speeches in order to interact with the speakers. And after that, I'll be pleased to give a word to Mia Dragovic to speak about the multi project and the Croatian experience. Thank you very much for your attention. Enjoy the webinar, and please, Mia.
Thank you, Dario. I'm not sure, should I upload the presentation, or do you have my presentation ready? No? Then I should do it.
Yet.
Wait, let's see. Okay, so let's...
Perfect.
Okay, you see it? Excellent.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you everyone, and hello and welcome. My name is Mia Dragovic, and I have been working for the past year in the Energy Institute Hrvatski Požar. Before this, I was in the National Energy Efficiency Authority, and before that, I dealt with sustainable energy management in cities and counties. So basically, I deal with the economic management and policy side of energy efficiency. And since I believe there is many backgrounds here today, I would not like to go into details because I believe you're all familiar with the details, but I would also like to pose a lot of questions and for all of us to take a step back and maybe consider some misconceptions in the measurement and monitoring, measurement and verification, and take this with us and maybe to be better at and more consistent in what we do. Also, what we will try to do, since there are a lot of topics and a lot of things I would like to leave you with, I will not go into details, but rather give you a lot of links that you can later on check out and contact me if you want to know more about any of the topics we will mention today. So we will mention the multi project and some deliverables that will be useful to you. We will talk about data collection and how we handled it both through the multi, but also in Croatia through our system for measurement and verification that we call SMEV, and some problems and misconceptions. So I would like to start first with why we do all of this that we do, and I'm glad I'm not the only one that has cartoons in my presentation. So basically, I've been doing this a long time, and what I've seen in Croatia, especially, that a lot has been going on, but most of it has not been measured up until maybe 2 years ago. And the similar thing happens in many countries. I'm sure you also can see this. This is why now we have many projects that deal with energy efficiency on different levels. So, for example, we have the SEAPs, or Sustainable Energy Action Plans, and usually their goals, as far as I've seen, they're not included in national plans, and this is really a pity. So we're doing a lot, but we don't have the real, we don't measure it all. And this is a city I currently work and live in, Zagreb. This is the main street, Ilica, and I heard a very interesting story from my colleagues that are dealing with a large project in energy efficiency in buildings, and they were proudly showing our city to architects from all around the world. And we have a lot of this Austro-Hungarian secession architecture, and we were proudly presenting it, and one of the architects asked, well, you know, it's all nice, but why are the buildings so old and why aren't they renovated? And really, you don't see it when you don't notice it when you walk by every day, but I think all of us and all of the politicians would know what to do. We had immense resources, and of course we all know what's smart, but we don't. We have scarce resources, and we also have different reasons for dealing with energy efficiency. And one of the reasons I see that we forget most of the times is that behind this there are CO2 emissions. So not only energy savings, then money savings that are motivator, but also we need to mind the footprint. And in best case scenario, we would renovate all buildings, implement all measures, but we need to figure out first where we are using the energy and why we are using this. So with keeping this in mind, we talk a lot about measurement and verification, or monitoring and verification, but many times I don't see this third M. So in most of the countries, especially a few years back, some elements were present, but not all of them. So it's important to remember that we need to monitor, measure, and verify. Verification is something I think we will be talking a lot in the next few years. I think this is now the hot topic in MNV. So not only do we have to do it as a first step, but also in many research has shown that it actually saves money. I dealt with this large project of energy efficiency in public buildings, and most of the times, and you can check this yourself, if you go to your city, your mayor back home where you grew up, I'm sure that if you ask them how much money is being spent on, I don't know, electricity in your schools, I'm sure they would know. And even if they would, the data would be provided from somebody who is not an engineer and who really, probably economist, who wouldn't know how to answer, is this too much or too little? And that's the problem. That's where we need to connect the data monitoring with actual measurement, and then decide which measures to implement. So I believe 3 important questions before we go on the Croatian case and Malti are: what do we monitor, what is the purpose of monitoring, and what is the cost? So we talk a lot about bottom-up versus top-down, and many times it seems like there are 2 opposite sides, but actually I think both are important. And I've had a lot of countries ask that if our company could do bottom-up measurements for them. But if they don't have national statistics, and if they don't have enough top-down information available or energy statistics, then it's not feasible and it's not possible to do actual bottom-up measurements, because you cannot have algorithms unless you know what the state in the country is, or it will not be accurate enough. Then there is the scope that we mentioned, that many times we have a lot of measures implemented, but national and local do not always come together. For example, in Germany, which is doing great with energy efficiency, but they have independent local authorities that really, nationally, maybe they're not connected as well as they could be. And then comes the double counting. So even though a lot has been done, people are not sure how to deal with same measures or different measures on same buildings or same properties or So this problem of double counting was also nicely handled with the SMEV, or the system that we will talk about today. Then when we come to actual or factual measurement, this is very interesting and connected to the next question, or what is the purpose? So when I deal with authorities, they usually just ask, you know, what do the directives say? What does the law say? What's the legislative requirement? We'll do as much as the requirement asks and no more. And then there's the actual purpose and the actual savings. That should be an incentive for somebody to save energy and save money. So different projects have different purposes, but I think that the purpose behind all this should include both the directives and the actual savings, which is not always the same thing. And then the main question maybe is, what is the cost? Because we can measure a lot, but it can cost too much, and maybe it would be better, as we said, just to renovate what we can. So it's very important to find this balance, and usually not so easy. So multi-project has been dealing with some of these questions. It has been going on since 2015 through 2017, and it aims to improve the consistency and quality of energy efficiency policy planning and implementation through innovative monitoring and verification schemes, and improve coordination between different administrative levels. And what I would like you to take from this is the 4 deliverables that are available online. So I will mention each one of those, and I really urge you to go online and check each one of them that are of interest to you. So first is the European Best Practices for MNV. And this one, as well as the third one, the Synthesis Report on MNV Schemes and Coordination Mechanisms in EU countries, will help you maybe to also find out who to contact, who is doing what in each country. But the main and the most, in my opinion, maybe the most important material was the report on general formula of bottom-up methods, where a lot of engineers came together from different countries, and we tried to put them all in one place. At least it's not a handbook that is perfect for all countries. It is just one place where each country can take a look as a catalog and see what they could implement, what they haven't done yet, or maybe even come to us and say, hey, you haven't included this and this. We would be really happy to get any feedback on that. But this is really interesting, and I urge you to check it out. So the consortium members are the following, as you see on the picture, but we have dealt with all EU and Macedonia, and so we try to include as many countries and many experiences as possible. And the next result from Multi is the MNV platform, similar that Croatia has, and the SMEV that I mentioned. So all of the countries in the project had the possibility to implement this in their countries. So Lithuania, Latvia, Slovakia, Macedonia, and Greece, they did ask for this system to be localized. Then we have Austria and Croatia that already have this system or platform. And then we had Germany and Denmark, which for obvious reasons did not want to, did not consider this a solution, because this system we are talking about is for bottom-up measurements, as we mentioned. Germany already has local implementation, and they use mostly top-down approach, while Denmark already has great practices and their own systems. And as we know, they're a leader in many energy efficiency matters, so they didn't need the system. Then we also have Ukraine and Moldova that I heard that are implementing this system, but not through this project, but rather through GIZ, because this started through a project done with GIZ, and they're trying to implement it further, so it's not tied to the countries in the project. And then the system can be adapted to any of the countries, and it can be adapted into any way the country wants it to. So the list of algorithms that go into the system is really up to any country. If you have 5 or 50, it can all be implemented in. Of course, the country needs to have the bottom-up methodology. Without it, it's just a simple IT tool without any substance. Everything can be translated to a certain country, and then, of course, reference values are entered for that country from the bottom-up methodology. And it's transferred to the local server, and then from then on, the country deals with the system in the way they want to. So basically, the success of the system or the platform depends on how well the country is collecting the data and doing the verification. So if you're interested, or you think your country or any of the partners you work with is interested in this, you can talk to me or anybody from Multi or GIZ, and we can go from there. And then let's talk a bit about Croatia. We still struggle with a lot of issues in energy efficiency, especially the energy efficiency obligation schemes. But what we're really good about is writing policy, and not because I took part in it, but really we have all the policy in place. When it comes to implementation, we are still struggling. But what we did well is this platform. This is something we are really proud of, because it took a lot of time, but now it's taking a lot less time and less money to do the same things that we needed to do before, and we're really having a hard time with it. So what you see here, the pie chart, this is done after the second NIEP, and this is how much our target until 2016. And from this, we measured in 2012, we measured the top-down. The orange part is how much we did, orange or pink, whatever you see on your screen. And then the green one is what I did with the bottom-up methods. But the way of collecting this was actually calling every authority and asking them, how many buildings did you renovate? How many new buses did you buy? And things like that. And you can imagine it's really not for this century to do things in this way. So we are very proud of that we started to measure it, but we said, hey, let's take it a step further and let's implement a system that will do this for us. So with the help of GIZ, we did this in 2008, and since then it has been entered in our Energy Efficiency Act, which is something I believe is really important, and I will mention this later on again. I believe there should be sort of a carrot and stick, or both the motivation through laws, and so through maybe punishment, and through some kind of incentive. Otherwise, nothing will be accomplished. So it's in the law, and we'll see who are the obligated parties. But what the system does, it measures targets under not only Article 7 that we talk mostly about here, but also Article 5, or the national building stock, and Articles 3, or all the other measures. And it can avoid double counting. I put a question mark here because, again, it depends on how you run the system. But if you do it wisely, if you have some sort of a system of recognizing either through ID, or it can be through a land on which the measure is being implemented, depends on how well this is sorted out in your country, but you can connect it maybe even to a name of a person, so you can see how much, if two measures have been implemented in the same place. And then if you have a manageable number of obligated parties, it's really easy to follow savings. So no more calling the public authorities and doing everything the old-fashioned way. And how did we include all the sectors? Well, here's the part that's obligatory through the law. And so we obliged the public sector and all financial institutions and all distributors through EOs to plan their measures. And we figured it's not only important to have the measures realized, because some of the measures were happening as it is, because, I don't know, the roof of the school was leaking and they had to change it, but is that actually energy efficiency? And we wanted to see how much of the measures are actually implemented because of the national acts. And so these three sectors need to plan, and need to plan yearly, and deliver their plans through SMEEV. So also everybody can see what other cities are doing, and maybe it can serve as a sort of a motivator for them. And then we have the carrots, and this is everybody else who is not obliged, for example, SMEs or the residential sector, but they have, thankfully, we have an eco fund that gives a lot of money out to all the sectors, and everything that is subsidized so it needs to be entered in the system. So in this way, we have every house in Croatia that changed roofs or windows and did it with the help of the co-financing through EcoFund. This is all entered into our platform. So what are the motivation mechanisms? I mentioned carrots and sticks. I believe seven to nine countries now have or declare to have an eco fund, and this really helps because in our case, 34% of all savings in the second NIAP were done were recorded through eco fund. But now what we have in the platform, over 90% of all savings are entered through eco fund. So they're our main obligated party, and this really helps because you have one actor that you need to teach how to use the platform. And what we also find important is the competition among local governments and making their plans publicly available, which is not so much done and is a problem with CEAPS because there are a lot of plans we don't know how much of it has been realized. But also, what does it mean to plan? It's one thing to say that you will renovate 20 buildings, but it's a completely other thing to put it in a local budget. And this is what we ask for. If it's in the plan, it needs to be in the local budget, so money for it, or part of it needs to be planned out. And the sticks are the data that needs to be monitored and delivered for all companies providing energy service sector. So anybody, service contracts. So any ESCO company needs to enter their contract or just part of the contract that is that can be publicly available in the system. Public sector we talked about, and the subsidy providers. They all need to do this. And we have fines not only for example, a public body, some city, but also for the mayor that is responsible in the city. They get fines for not doing this. And what is the status with our platform? We have approximately 7,000 measures now registered in SMEEV. We just started this year, so it may not seem as a lot, but it is, because I cannot imagine how many calls I would need to make for 7,000 measures. In this way, we educated only 80 users, and with this we covered all public bodies in Croatia. We also have 30 local energy efficiency plans entered into SMEEV, so we can project how much will be done in the future. And the verified savings so far are 0.61 petajoules. This is just a screenshot. It doesn't look like this, but you're more than welcome to ask me, and I can go with any of you who's interested through the actual platform. So what I would like to leave you with today is 3 things. First, I would be very happy if you take with you any of the deliverables or interesting informative materials, and if you go out and check out Multi website. Secondly, no matter how much we complicate this issue of measurement and verification, since I work a lot with public policy, I know that on the local level it's really simple, or on the citizen level there are 2 questions. What do I need to do? Am I obliged to do this? And how much will it cost me? And what do I get from it? So if it's not simple, if it's not consistent and verified, most likely it will not be done. And the third thing is that it's really important for all of us to always remember or think about what is the purpose of the monitoring and measurement we are doing. So it can be satisfying directives, it can be actual savings, or even going beyond the savings and doing something more for additional benefits for the community. So just let's keep all that in mind. Thank you, and please, you can write to me or ask me now if you have some questions.
Thank you, Mia. Are there any questions now? If not, we will discuss at the end of the presentation. And thank you again, Mia, for this interesting presentation. I think this introduced quite well the topic of today's webinar. Now the word to Nina Pickel from the the Austrian Energy Agency. Please, Nina. Nina, remember the microphone?
Okay. Hello to everyone. Sorry. I hope everyone can hear me now and can see the presentation. My name is Nina Pickel, and I work for the Austrian Energy Agency, and we are involved in several energy efficiency projects as the ENSPOL one, which is more dealing about the implementation of Article 7, and also Multi-EE, which I will talk about now, which is more focusing on monitoring and verification practices, as well as coordination mechanisms. And I will now just give you a short introduction or an overview of how the monitoring and verification in Austria works. So, whoops. Before talking about the monitoring and verification procedures in Austria, I'd like to open up a little more the scope and briefly describe the data collection process, as this is actually an essential basis in order to be able to have thorough monitoring and verification of the energy efficiency measures. Talking about that, I'd like to mention the Austrian law on energy efficiency. So in July 2014, the Austrian legislature passed the new Energy Efficiency Act, transposing the 2012 Energy Efficiency Directive in order to meet the European 2020 targets. And this Austrian Energy Efficiency Act actually regulates a lot of details concerning the reporting and data collection process. For example, it is in there mentioned in how often measures need to be reported. So in here we have an exact date. It's actually Valentine's Day, so it's the 14th of February of the following year that every obligated party has to report their measures. It is also regulated that a monitoring body should be implemented and established, having the competence to decide whether and to what extent the reported measures will be taken into account. And this act also regulates compensation payments or administrative fines in case some of the obligated parties do not report in time or do wrong reporting whatsoever. According to this Energy Efficiency Act, one monitoring body was elected by a competitive bidding process, and it was us, the Austrian Energy Agency, which won that bidding process and was designated in May 2015 as the one national monitoring body. And as a national monitoring agency, we are responsible for setting up the data collection process, which is partly defined already in the Energy Efficiency Act. Whatever is not defined has been defined then by us. And it is also our duty to inform all the relevant stakeholders and the affected groups that you can see on this side here. So we have the energy suppliers and the public authorities that are really obligated to report energy efficiency measures and that have targets that they have to reach. Then we have the energy consuming enterprises that are obliged to do audits or have a management system. And then we have the energy service providers that can support all the energy consuming enterprises and the energy suppliers with their energy efficiency measures. And as the National Monitoring Agency, we have lots of responsibilities and duties, which are also specified in the articles of the Federal Law of Energy Efficiency. And here are some just to mention. So we have to define the data flow process. We have to make sure that obligated companies register in our monitoring system. We have to assess the qualification of the energy service providers. We are constantly developing new methods for the calculation of energy savings, so for bottom-up energy savings. We do the controlling, the evaluation of the measures that are being reported, and also the observation of the Austrian market. So the data collection process in Austria is regulated. So how this data collection process is organized is on this slide now. So all obligated parties have to report their measures yearly, so until the 14th of February. The data they have to report is also very clearly defined, so they have to report the type of measure, the energy savings, so either using standardized or individual measures. They have to provide information on the customer that they have implemented the energy efficiency measure, so really with name and address, date of implementation of the measure. And then they also need to have all the documentation for all these energy efficiency measures. So this has not, they do not have to hand it in beforehand, but they have to make this available in case we as National Monitoring Agency ask for it and ask for more detailed data. And it's also the fact that we have time, like 6 months after the submission of the data, we have time to ask for more detailed information. And corrections or additions of submissions can be requested for the 2 preceding years. So this already shows that this data collection process is really very clearly defined, and this enables us actually to have a thorough monitoring and verification of the data that is being reported. So now we come to the formal monitoring and verification process in Austria. One important thing is that we have one single monitoring system. So in this single monitoring system, we collect all the data in an online database in order to be able to really handle all this information that is being reported by the different obligated parties. And in order to use this online database, companies, energy providers have to register, and then this registration is being proved by us, and then they receive a personal account. And this personal account really makes it clear at each moment who entered the data for the company, which is also very important to not keep that anonymous. And all measures are being reported via online forms, so there is no possibility to just email the data for energy efficiency measures. Everything has to be sent via these online forms, via this online database. So we recently had, so until this year, February this year, there was the first reporting period, so all obligated parties had to report their energy efficiency measures. All of them have been collected in this one online database. And important also to mention here that there is no pre-checks that we have done, and all the measures are really controlled and verified after being reported. So now out of all these measures that have been reported, we do certain checks in order to really verify the data and the measures that are being reported. So there is plausibility checks that we have. Also, we receive external suggestions, and we take random samples out of all these measures. And then we have detailed checks. So this is something that is going on right now. We have those detailed checks are like desktop checks or on-site checks. The plausibility check, this is something that is being done over all data that is being entered, so all measures that have been entered. This is automatic to a large extent, and with this we also want to avoid things like double counting. Concerning the detailed desktop check, this means that the reported data is being verified and validated by a research associate, really sitting at his or her PC workstation. So the calculation and documentation is being evaluated based on the paper files that have been submitted through our IT solution. And the topics that are being checked with these desktop checks are, so is the general information about the company correct? Is everything there, like address, energy sales, etc.? Then is the result of the calculation correct? So were the right default values used from the bottom-up method? Are the project-specific values transparent? Then concerning the validation process, was the right calculation method used for the energy efficiency measure? And yeah, for the evidence, do the documents that have been handed in really prove that the existence of the measure? And is it sufficient and true, or do we need more information? Then, apart from these desktop checks, there is also the possibility to do on-site checks. So there is, currently we have 25 days per year to do such on-site checks, and where we really want to see the implemented measure on-site. But since this is very time-consuming, of course, this is a rather small part of the whole process. So, summarizing, you could say that the entire control procedure is that every energy efficiency measure that has been reported is going through this plausibility check, which is carried out automatically. And then suspicious measures are taken out and controlled in detail. And furthermore, there's an extra sample taken to control measures out of all. And we also get some external suggestions like the whistleblowers, those measures that we will really check, and those mostly like on-site checks. So this is about the procedure. We write in this procedure now, controlling all the about 10,000 measures that have been reported, so these are being controlled right now. And summarizing, we could say that it is really helpful, or also important, I guess, to have a decree on the National Monitoring Agency via a legally binding act. So for us, it's the Austrian Energy Efficiency Act. It's important to really have a well-defined data collection process, because only then you know what you can monitor and what you have to verify. Then you have to define a decent monitoring process, which will help you to measure and verify the energy savings. Then also reporting the measures via one single tool and via one online tool is very helpful. And furthermore, in case some obligated parties do not report for whatever reason, we have the possibility to pose penalties on them. And yes, there's one big service also to provide stakeholders with information constantly, so you can never inform them enough. But having all this will help you in your monitoring and verification process, I guess, as it did in Austria. So that was it, actually. Just a short insight on how we do it. What I'd like to mention also here is that really we did within this multi-E project an extensive survey on how the individual monitoring and verification processes work in the different member state countries. So there is big reports that we have compiled, and I really recommend you to have a look at them. And in case you have any questions for the Austrian examples, feel free to ask. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nina. In fact, there are two questions. You can find them in the chat panel. Nevertheless, they are: how many measures are generally reported each year through the system?
I mean, now it was the first year, it's more than 10,000 measures that have been reported. I have, it's almost 11,000, so 10,880 measures that have been reported.
Okay, perfect. That's a large number. And second, what sort of additional information or data could the agency request? For example, eligibility documentation, savings calculation, etc.
Like, for example, if you don't use standardized measures or standardized values, but project-specific values, we need the information of an external expert on how these numbers or how this data has been derived, or, for example, bills that prove the implementation of the measures, or yeah, things like that.
Okay. Another question: what sort of penalties can be imposed for misreporting? And what is the legislative basis for these penalties? Are they imposed by the agency or another public body?
By the ministry then. So in this Energy Efficiency Act, it's really stated that we can, in case there is something has been reported wrongly on purpose, for example. I mean, this depends also on how big was the failure, but the penalty can be from 10,000 euros up to 100,000 euros, depending on how big this failure was. And it's then the ministry, how do you say, imposing the penalty.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay, thank you. If there are other questions that can be asked during the discussion. Now it's time for Frank Hams from Hopgem to illustrate the UK experience. Thank you, Nina, and see you later.
Thank you.
Let's see. Okay, can everybody hear me and see the presentation?
Yes, perfect.
Excellent. There we go. Okay, thank you very much for having me again. So we're in the slightly odd position, I suppose, where the United Kingdom is being represented by a Dutchman at a time where we have great uncertainty about the UK's position, sort of vis-a-vis the EU and that sort of stuff. But I won't dwell on that for too long. I think what I should probably explain before we start is that what we sort of consider, what we understand under monitoring and verification is two things. I think in the previous two presentations, there was a lot of focus on how do you properly account for the energy savings that are being delivered by measures that are installed under any program. And that is something that we obviously also do as the agency that's responsible for the administration of the supplier obligation scheme in the UK. But the other thing that we do, and that I'll be focusing more on in this presentation, is we have a second strand of monitoring and verification that is geared towards making sure that the measures that are installed are actually up to a certain quality in terms of the installation and are also being calculated accurately. So what I would suggest is that where anyone has questions about more of this sort of accounting type of monitoring and what we do, feel free to ask those as well. So my role, as it says on the tin here, is I'm the Operations and Compliance Manager. So I'm mainly responsible for our quality assurance monitoring and verification, but I know a fair bit about the other types of monitoring and verification that we also employ. So I'll be happy to take questions on that as well. For instance, if people have questions about how we do checks on additionality or other eligibility criteria. And I may at times deviate from my slide a bit as well and give some more info about how our scheme works, even though it isn't strictly speaking in the presentation. So having said all of that, just give you a short overview of what our scheme is. We administer the Energy Company Obligation Scheme. This is only one part of the way in which the UK meets its obligations under the Energy Efficiency Directive. As it says, it is a supplier obligation scheme under which they are obligated to install energy efficiency measures to residential properties only. So we do not, our scheme does not deal with energy efficiency measures in industry or transport, for instance, and I know that in some other member states that is the case. So, but we do just the residential sector. The first scheme ran from 2013 to 2015. The second phase of the scheme is now going to continue into early 2017, and we now have a commitment from the government to run some version of this scheme at least into 2022. What will happen though is that the focus of the scheme is going to shift to a certain extent, or at least the ministry has the intention to shift the focus, and we'll probably see more focus on addressing fuel poverty and less focus necessarily on the reduction of carbon emissions. We administer the scheme for what used to be the Department of Energy and Climate Change. That department has recently been merged with another department, so there's a bit of flux there as well. And our role is, in the first instance, we use the legislation to set the obligation for the energy suppliers. Only energy suppliers that have a minimum number of customers and a minimum supply volume for both electricity and gas are obligated, and then the obligation is directly proportional to their market share. We then get measures reported to us from the obligated energy suppliers on a monthly basis, and we do a number of checks immediately the month after the measures have been reported to us to see if the measures are eligible. I think at the moment the notification template that suppliers use contains about somewhere between 60 and 70 fields. Not all those fields are relevant for each individual measure, but for instance, to give you a bit of a flavor of what we look after, we get obviously address information, the savings associated with the measure, but for one of our current fuel poverty sub-obligations, we also record how the supplier has determined that the person that the measure was installed to is indeed fuel or meets one of the proxy criteria for fuel poverty that are in the legislation. We then monitor compliance by the suppliers, so as well as assessing the measures, we also make sure that the processes are up to scratch and that they have sufficient controls in place to make sure that the measures that they report to us are correct and eligible. We report the progress of the suppliers to the Secretary of State on a monthly basis, and then we provide a lot of guidance and information on our website. And we also respond to queries from both suppliers, other parties in the supply chain, and the general public. I think the supply chain is perhaps, it's good to emphasize how it works for us. So although, and also because some of the challenges that we face as an administrator are the direct result from how the energy suppliers choose to fulfill their obligations. So the obligated energy suppliers are being set a target for the period of the scheme, but most of them don't actually go and meet the obligation themselves. Obviously, their core business is to provide energy in the retail market, and it is not to install boilers or cavity wall installation. So they contract with managing agents to deliver the energy efficiency measures. The managing agents usually use installers or subcontractors in local areas to do that sort of work, and then the calculation savings is usually provided by domestic energy assessors, which are usually hired by the installers. So from the obligated energy supplier down, there can be various other parties in the supply chain until you get to the guy at the end who does the actual installation. And that can present problems because our legislative remit only extends to the obligated energy suppliers. So if someone further down the line makes a mistake or deliberately misreports something, so for instance, if a domestic energy assessor was to inflate the score of a measure, we can't directly act on the domestic energy assessor who did this because our legislative remit only extends to the supplier. So a lot of what we do is trying to either encourage or force is perhaps a strong word, but strongly urge suppliers to have processes in place to make sure that they make sure that the people further down the supply chain do their job correctly and don't commit fraud. So in terms of monitoring and verification, some of the activities that we undertake are monitoring of the installation quality and scores, and with this we mean on-site inspections. We also have verification of the reported scores, so when suppliers report measures to us, we have an automated, semi-automated system in place that flags scores that look mildly suspicious to us. These are the two elements I will treat in a bit more detail in the remainder of the presentation. We also do audits, and the audits are process and risk-based, so especially when new suppliers become obligated, we'll have an external party audit them to see if all the processes are up to scratch, but also, just like my Austrian colleague, for instance, mentioned, if you get allegations from either the supply chain or from a whistleblower, that something is amiss with a particular type of measure, for instance, then we might do an audit on that particular measure type. So a good example of an audit that we've recently completed is we had concerns over the eligibility of boiler measures installed under our scheme. So we did an audit of about 300 boilers from the various suppliers to check if they actually met the eligibility criteria. And then there are reviews, and they're quite similar to audits. They're usually in response to reported non-compliance. The difference between reviews and audits, from our position, is that reviews are usually something where we don't engage an external party, but we ask the suppliers to do a lot of evidence checking themselves, and then we get the results of that, and then we act on those results. So to go to monitoring, as I said, it is on site. We have a requirement that suppliers monitor 5% of the measures that they install. They don't do this themselves, and we don't do it either. We don't have the manpower to do it, and obviously the supplier is not supposed to go monitor their own measures. So the supplier has an obligation to engage an independent third party to do monitoring for them. The third party reports the monitoring results to the supplier, and the supplier then reports it unaltered to us. There are two types of monitoring. There is what we call technical monitoring, which focuses on the installation quality, and score monitoring that focuses on the scores. There is also a requirement that at least 3% of all the measures by a particular installer are monitored, and this is to make sure that the measures that are monitored are representative across all the partners that a supplier works with in the supply chain, and to avoid a situation where we monitor 50% of one installer's measures and then nothing of 10 other installers that a particular supplier uses. The questions that the inspectors take to every site were developed by us, and they are targeted to either identify the impacts in the scoring calculation that can have the highest influence on the savings that are reported, or when it's about installation quality, there are questions that are targeted at those mistakes that can be made that will most significantly impact the ability of the measure to generate savings. I'll give an example of each of those. In terms of the quality of installation, for instance, if someone has installed cavity wall insulation, the question is, have all the holes that have been drilled in the wall to inject the cavity wall insulation been filled up again? Because otherwise, if the holes haven't been filled up, there's a risk that that water might penetrate the wall, the insulation will become damp and will cease to function, and might actually present a health and safety hazard as well. So that's a very important thing to get right. And on the scoring, one of the questions that we may ask is, again, let's assume you've installed cavity wall insulation in the property. The scores and the eco at the moment are, for purposes of EED, you would consider them deemed scores, but they're very accurately deemed scores. So the score takes into account a lot of different inputs about the property, so its size, the heating system that's present, what type of property it is, and also, for instance, the wall type and if any other insulation is already present. So you do a sort of whole house survey to see exactly what impact the energy efficiency measure that you're installing will have in this particular property. And so from that perspective, the scores are more or less unique, or at least bespoke for each property where an eco measure is installed, but they're not metered, for instance. So because of this, some of these parameters can have quite a big impact. If I go and install cavity wall insulation in the property, and I fail to mention that the property already has 25 centimeters of loft insulation, the carbon savings achieved by the cavity wall insulation will appear to be inflated. So that's one of the things, for instance, that we check. Similarly, in terms of carbon and cost savings, it makes quite a big difference if you put in that the property is heated by a coal burner, for instance, instead of a mains gas boiler. So those are areas where a less than scrupulous or less scrupulous installer could try to get a higher score for a measure than they would otherwise get, and that's what the questions are targeted on. Now, the consequence of this is that if we identify that if a measure fails any of the questions that we've posed, the installer will have, or the supplier will have to either rescore the measure if we have determined that the score wasn't correctly calculated, or if there's a problem with the installation, they will have to go and send the installer back to fix the measure. So, for instance, in the example of the cavity wall insulation, if you haven't made good all the holes in the wall, the installer will have to go back and fill up the 1 or 2 holes they forgot to do the first time around. If the supplier or the installer refuse or fail to do this, or are unable to do it because, for instance, the customer doesn't allow them back into the property again, ultimately we can refuse to award savings to that measure, and it is rejected, and it will not be counted towards the supplier's obligation target. And this is very much the situation that we also had in ECO 1. One of the things that we've introduced in ECO 2 is, if for a particular installer we see a lot of failures, we'll take more preemptive action, and we take action across the wider body of measures and not just the measures that were inspected. So we may at some point say, well, this installer has so many issues that we will not actually approve any of their measures until the supplier can demonstrate that they've done something, or the installer has done something to make sure that the quality improves. We may ask them to conduct additional monitoring. We will ask them to give us a root cause analysis to exactly what is causing all these issues with this installer. We will want to see improvement plans, and we'll then continue to monitor this installer to see if that performance improves. And if it doesn't, the actions that we will take will become more and more severe, up to the point where we might say we will reject all the measures installed by this installer because we don't have faith any of them are of the appropriate quality or are accurately scored. Though our experience so far has been that this process really triggers improvement in the supply chain, and we have not yet had to do a wholesale rejection of measures. So this whole process is called the Pathways to Compliance, and one of the things that we identified as very important around this is to give a lot of guidance to suppliers and installers about how it works and what they need to do to show to us that the measures that they've installed are of the appropriate quality and accuracy. So we've put a lot of guidance on our website to explain what the trigger rate is above which we will take further action, how severe the action will be, or what we expect the installer to do based on the failure rate that has been reported, when we need this information by, and eventually what might happen if the installer remains non-compliant. I don't think this process flow that I've put on this particular slide is very useful now, but I know that the slides are going to be put online, so you could study it later in more detail. So in terms of, and unfortunately I only have the results for ECO1, but the results for ECO1 were that 1.4 million measures were installed across the whole duration of the scheme, and of those about 100,000 measures were inspected. Of those 100,000, 15,000 measures failed the inspection. The majority of those failed on the quality of installation, and a slightly smaller number of measures failed on the accuracy of scoring. Now, the more perceptive amongst you will notice that 9.9 thousand plus 6.5 thousand added together yields more than 15,000, and that is because some measures failed on both installation and on scoring. So in those cases, the installer would have to both fix the measure and rescore it, potentially. Ultimately, of those 15,000, the vast majority were corrected, corrective action was taken, and only 2,448 measures ended up being rejected by us. This graph shows you how the failure rate developed over time. So there was an initial sort of increase in the failure rate across all suppliers, but by the end of the scheme there's a very definite downward trend, and I'm very pleased to say that this has continued into ECO2, so the failure rates that we are currently seeing are actually a lot lower than the ones that we saw in ECO1, and we think that that is in large part due to this additional pathways to compliance that we've set up. So that was the on-site monitoring. Then there's a second process called score verification, which is something that we do in-house and is desk-based. And the way it works is that we have modeled what we think are acceptable scores for a particular measure. So, as I mentioned before, the scores are all bespoke calculations for the individual properties, but we have done some modeling in-house ourselves to determine what we think is the maximum acceptable score for a given property archetype. So, for instance, it is based on what sort of measure is being installed, and then how big the property is, or what the property type is, and what sort of what the primary heating source is. So, we, for instance, have a particular score for cavity wall insulation measures installed in a bungalow that is on that is using electric storage heaters, for instance. So when we assess all the measures each month, one of the things that we do is we run all the scores past this model that we've developed, and any measures that exceed the thresholds that we've set will fall out of this exercise and will be flagged, and we will send those back to the suppliers to sense check. Now, in ECO1, what we did is we treated those measures as immediately suspicious, and one of the things that we've changed going into ECO2 is we now treat them more as errors, because what we identified is that in the vast majority of cases, nothing suspicious was actually going on. The two main causes for a measure to exceed our thresholds were either because it's a very particular property, so it's a lot bigger than average, for instance, which inflates the score, or the supplier or the installer had made a very mistake that was very easily spotted and was easy to correct. So the most obvious example there is that, for instance, they would put the decimal point in the wrong place, inflate or deflate the floor area of the property by a factor of 10, and it gives you either a tiny score, which is unrealistic, or it gives you a massive score, which is also unrealistic, and that was very easily corrected. So we send all these things back as errors to suppliers, and we basically say, have them look over your calculation to see if there's something obviously wrong with it, or if there's a very obvious reason why this property has a higher or lower score that is we think is sensible. It is possible that from this, the supplier isn't immediately to answer the question as to why the score is different. And in that case, we may ask for more evidence. So we may ask the supplier to provide, or at least themselves, look at the underlying calculation, to look at floor plans, the notes of the energy assessor, previous energy assessments have been on the property, to evidence that the score is actually correct. If it turns out the score isn't correct, the supplier is then asked to change the score and recalculate it and report it again. And that happens on a monthly basis. There is a similar process where we analyze on a more long-term basis, so quarterly. We do trend analysis across all measures, and we identify if there's anything suspicious going on a larger scale. So, for instance, if we see a gradual increase without any further explanation in the scores that are claimed for loft insulation, as an example. And we may then ask suppliers to just sample check a random set of loft insulation measures to see why the scores are gradually creeping up. One of the current examples for this is that we've seen a very, very sudden upsurge in the number of room and roof installations that are being claimed. So that is one of the things where we may go back to suppliers and say, gosh, we've noticed that this measure is all of a sudden wildly more popular than it was 4 months ago. We think it's a bit strange because we haven't changed anything. Could you go and check why this is, and if you see anything uncouth with the scores going on? So this is, again, it's not particularly meaningful perhaps for you, but it's sort of it's a distribution diagram of the scores of loft insulation. So higher scores are to the right, and the y-axis gives you the number of measures. So this is the sort of analysis that we would do, and we would ask ourselves, why is it this weird spike sort of on the left-hand side of the graph? So there are definitely a few challenges that we've had in integrating our monitoring and verification that we do with existing systems that are already out there. And to be perfectly honest, and to perhaps answer a question that some of you have had during this presentation, is why is the energy regulator doing quality assurance checks of the installation of energy efficiency measures? And the reason for that is that in our experience, the existing quality assurance mechanisms in the industry itself did not initially give us sufficient confidence that the measures claimed under our energy efficiency supply obligation scheme would actually function properly. And I think the failure rates that we identified in ECO1 definitely substantiated this and vindicated us doing our own quality assurance here. But of course, you do then bump into efforts that other people are doing. So For instance, every domestic energy assessor has to be accredited, and these accreditation bodies also undertake their own audits of their members. So you don't want to overburden people in the supply chain, sort of stakeholders in the supply chain, with all these monitoring and verification systems. The other problem that we've had is, what do you do if someone is non-compliant? And the problem here mainly is that in almost every single case of non-compliance, it is not the obligated supplier who has done something wrong. It's not one of the parties that they work with down the supply chain, and we can't, as I said, we can't act on those parties. So we can't fine an installer for a score that's too high, or we can't blacklist, for instance, an installer who structurally and persistently delivers shoddy work. All we can do is try and encourage the suppliers not to contract with those people. Part of the way we do this is by having these consequences where we would quarantine or reject measures that we have no confidence in, because it's very annoying for a supplier to have measures rejected. So it means that they will try and put processes in place to avoid this from happening. And also, in the ultimate scenario, the supplier may decide not to work with a particular installer anymore. Similarly, modeling the suspicious scores has been quite tricky for us, because it's based on both the statistical analysis of the scores that we already have on our systems and doing our own calculations. But it's quite difficult to set boundaries that strike a good balance between not having too many false positives on the one hand, but also not letting too many actually suspicious scores slip through on the other. So yeah, as I mentioned, there are other monitoring and verification systems out there. Assessors, installers, and the products that they install are all subject to their own monitoring and verification systems for quality and accuracy. And one of the things that the department is currently looking at is how it can be made easier to share data between all these quality assurance bodies. Because at the moment, everybody is still sort of working in their own silo. We do our quality assurance work, but we don't share our information with, for instance, the accreditation bodies for installers. Whereas that would be quite useful, because if we can tell an accreditation body for installers that one of their members is underperforming and is persistently underperforming, they could actually take direct action against their member that we can't, but at the moment we can't give them that information. So a lot of work is currently being done by the department to see how this data sharing between all these agencies can be facilitated, and also how we can make sure that the different actors that operate in the sphere aren't checking the same things, but more that they're checking things that are complementary. Part of this is being investigated as part of the Bondfield Review, which is a UK-wide review of quality assurance framework that is going on. Includes both energy efficiency and renewables. Its scope is a lot wider than just monitoring and enforcement, because it also looks at customer redress, for instance, and having a single point of information for consumers if they have questions about installations. But it also covers how do you make sure that installers that do energy efficiency or renewables deliver good work. And it's very important for us because ECO is definitely at the moment the largest player in terms of energy efficiency measures being installed in the UK. I think this is something I've already mentioned, so how do you deter non-compliance? And the problem that the people who are responsible for it aren't always the ones that we can immediately act on. I was quite interested in the example that my Austrian colleague did about imposing penalties, because, for instance, that's not something that we can do, to the great frustration of both ourselves and of the suppliers. The largest penalty that we have is to reject the measure, so to take the savings away. But for instance, when it comes to duplication of measures, that is still a relatively light penalty, because if someone tries to sell a measure twice to two different suppliers and they succeed, and we pick up on this, we can reject one of them because it's a duplicate of the other and therefore not valid because it doesn't relate to a different installation, but one of the measures will always be retained. So it's a very high gain, low risk strategy for someone to try and make more money on the basis of one installation by selling it multiple times. And we cannot impose penalties on either installers or even on the suppliers. Our only power under the legislation is to take enforcement action against the supplier if they do not meet their obligations at the end of the scheme. But that is a very different type of non-compliance, and there's more low-level stuff on an individual measure basis. The other thing is that I think over the various workshops and webinars I've attended on this topic, I've come to the conclusion that the UK scheme is actually quite complicated, and that is because it tries to do a lot of different things. So it's trying to target certain areas, it's trying to target certain people, it's trying to restrict the types of measures that can be installed to certain people or in certain areas or in general. And the problem, of course, is that every time you create one of those requirements, you create a sort of associated incentive for people to game it. So there is a lot of there is a bit of an arms race going on, I feel at times, between us and the industry, where they try and find the most recent loophole, and then we go and try and plug it with either more guidance or more requirements or some form of sort of punitive action. And that is sometimes a bit of a frustrating dynamic. Modeling, again, I think I already mentioned this. It's how do you make a model so that you find scores that are suspicious, but without triggering too many that are actually okay, or without letting too many that are not okay go through. And that was it. As I mentioned before, I know that I've sort of I've skipped very briefly over how we do the sort of more sort of baseline accounting, so making sure, telling up all the measures that suppliers install and making sure they actually meet their obligations at the end. That's sort of that part of monitoring and verification. So if people have questions about this, or about how we do deduplication, or the sort of checks that we perform on a monthly basis, I'm also happy to take any questions on those topics, and I'll try and answer them to the best of my ability. And that was it. Thank you very much for listening to me ramble on about my favorite topic, and I do hope that there are some questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Frank. It was a very complete and comprehensive presentation. Are there any questions for Frank? Not yet, perhaps at the end during the discussion. So it's time for the last presentation, and I'll start as soon as I'll be given the role of presenter. Okay. So, I just remind you that you will find the proceedings and the registration of this webinar on anspol.eu/events or in our website. We have listened to a lot of interesting information from the other speakers about their schemes and how to deal with monitoring and verification. I will add something about the Italian situation. Starting from the basic idea, here there are some concepts that were already illustrated by Mia in her first presentation. So the basic idea is that monitoring is fundamental to understand where we are and how good we are at reaching the target we set for our policies. And of course, one of the main issues is that we have usually many different programs, policies, and schemes that interact and are needed to reach the global target. So one of the first issues is what we have to measure, because monitoring is based at least on some measures. And of course, there is the possibility to measure energy savings as estimates or measures metered, or energy consumption, where energy savings measures are not valuable, or even market development, that can be a possibility to add some information about non-energy benefits, for example. Many of the schemes we deal with are capable of delivering non-energy benefits. For example, they can be the growth of the ESCO market or the diffusion or energy performance contract, a rise in the number of employees, and so on. And so also the possibility to measure such improvements in the market is an interesting one. And also there are, of course, other possibilities in terms of what we are going to measure. And then how to measure. So using a centralized database of projects, that can be the most interesting idea. Mia illustrated something about that. Of course, the problem is that if you have many schemes working perhaps from a long time, then it's not simple to have just one centralized database of projects. Usually you have more than one. If you have at least one for every scheme, and that raises the issues how to cross-check between or among the different schemes and what kind of information you can extract. For example, now we are dealing with the UMERCI project, as I told you in the beginning of my presentation before, and one of the topic of the UMERCI project is to collect good practice starting by different databases. And of course, the problem is that every database has different types of information inside, and so even the theoretically simple duty of collecting this information, standardizing them, and putting them in another database to allow other people of confronting and accessing the information on the DB can be really challenging. And of course, there is the question top-down, bottom-up approach that is one of the main issues. On the other hand, we have the possibility to use the new ICT technologies with lower costs than before to try to centralize this complex of information. For example, we succeeded in Italy to do it for the electricity and gas market. Now we have a centralized information system in which all the flows for every consumer linked to the electricity or gas network is available. And for all the consumers that are linked with the smart meter, these flows are hourly and available almost in real time. So this has been a very interesting achievement, and doing something like that for energy efficiency would be very interesting. Unfortunately, one of the main issues with energy efficiency is that measuring energy efficiency is not easy. As you are noticing, I'm starting from the measurement, not from the monitoring and verification, because as Mia told in her presentation, the measurement is very important, and it has to be linked with the monitoring and the verification. Everybody knows that the problems arise since you need the measure of the instant consumption to be confronted with the baseline of ex-ante consumption that has to be adjusted, taking into account all the factors that influence the consumption. So, for example, the weather, the use of the building, the production of the industrial process, and so on. So this is not at all easy. You need measures variable. Otherwise, the only possibility you have is to try to estimate the energy saving. Going directly to the white certificate scheme, it is our main scheme dealing with energy efficiency. Just remind you briefly that is an energy efficiency obligation. The budget parties are the electricity and gas distributors with more than 50,000 users. And there is also the possibility to trade these certificates with the voluntary parties that are, in fact, the parties that usually collect white certificates and then sell them to the obliged parties. Voluntary parties in our schemes are ESCOs, and company with energy managers or energy management system in place, and also non-obliged distributors. So in this case, you can see that, of course, there are non-energy benefits in terms of effects on the market players, increase of the ESCO market, and so on, that can be added to the measurement of the effective energy savings and are an important addition. And by the way, are not really measured up to now, so it is something that most of the European scheme lack, as the ENSPOL project experience confirms. The main numbers about the Italian white certificate schemes are this one. We are dealing this year, for example, with a global target of 7.6 million of ton of oil equivalents as primary energy as a global target. They should be additional savings. 85% of the savings are metered. This is quite an important point, and also quite different from almost all the other schemes available in Europe. ESCOs has been the main actor in presenting projects and proposals, and they cover more or less 70% of the energy savings, whereas 25% comes from companies with energy managers, and the remaining 5% more or less from distributors. One of the issue is, of course, to have a flexible managing agency. In our case, the GSE now. Previously, it was the Electricity and Gas Authority, because we started with low targets, more or less 200,000 ton of oil equivalent in 2005, and so, for example, the savings proposal, PPPMs, rised since 150 in 2007 to 1,045 in 2014, and we are dealing more or less with 1,000 of proposal each year presently. And that of course, raises the question of how you deal with verification and controls, because with huge numbers, this activity is an important one. And of course, it has to be summed up to the other schemes, but in our case, are the HIT account, dealing with mainly the public administration, and also the service and residential sector, but only for the renewable thermal energy, and the tax deductions that covers mainly the residential sector. Another issue is the additionality. Since we have to consider only the savings that wouldn't be achieved under a business as usual scenario, this means that you have another degree of complication in terms of how to measure savings, and in addition to the general issue of how to determine energy savings. So it is not an easy task, and this poses also a complexity on the verification activities. I just remind you that in Italy there are 3 ways of evaluating the savings. We use demand savings projects that were the main ones in the first phase of the scheme, so in years 2005, 2006, 2007. There are scaled savings proposals in which some measurements are required. And finally, the most used approach is the metered saving proposal that is divided into 2 parts. First, the proponent presents a PPPM in which the algorithm, the baseline, and additionality, the metering chain, and all the information about the projects are given, and then after approval, it is possible to present the request for certificates at least once a year. So presently, this is the most used procedure for evaluating the savings, and that means that all the savings are metered. Metering is important because one of the tasks of verification is to assess if the estimates about the savings are in line with the real savings. with dividend saving files that have the advantage of being quite easy to use for the proponents. This is an important issue for the managing agency, because you have to find ways to try to look at the installation and at the real use of them in order to some way validate the estimates that the dividend saving files give about the energy savings. On the other hand, for example, by comparing the PPPM and the real savings afterwards in the metered savings in our country, we made a study considering all the proposals presented between 2005 and 2012, and we found 3 groups of proposals. There was one in which the estimates, there is a red line here, is not much visible, but there is just under the expected word. So there are cases in which the expected savings were in line with effective savings, and this was the situation mainly with lighting, heating, cooling, so typical cross-setting measures, or horizontal measures if you prefer, in which it was quite easy to determine the baseline and also the possible use of the technological solution. There is another group in which we saw a rise of the savings over the years, and this is typically the case of new technologies, for example, furnace glass membranes in industry, and alternative fuels for industry, because in this case usually the enterprises need time to set up and adjust the use of the new technologies, and so obtain the higher outcomes from them. And last, there is another groups, especially related to building materials or the manufacturing industry, in which a lot of times we saw effective savings lower than the expected ones. In this case, there is a higher influence, for example, from the crisis and their consequence on the market. So it is obvious that if you have metered savings in place, you will anyway get the real savings, and so it's not a problem. With the dividend savings files, this is an issue that it has to be answered some way or the other. In terms of verification process, in Italy, all the proposals for the white certificate schemes are evaluated in terms of documents presented and required information. To give you 2 examples, for simple technology like insulation for buildings or double glazing windows, the information are related mainly to the users that receive the interventions, and in terms of declaration that attest that all the technologies are in line with the existing standards in terms of performance, safety, and so on. For more complex solutions, like for example a district heating plant, of course there are also planimetries, electricity and gas network schemes, information about the used meters and their characteristics, a certificate of performance of buildings, something like that. And all these are nevertheless evaluated at the proposal time. You can wonder how much proposals are accepted at this point, and to answer this question, I will just, if I succeeded in it, in the GSE web page, there are some information directly in the home page that in fact gives you the summary of the presented proposal the proposals were completely assessed by GSE, and the one that were accepted. So as you can see, for example, this is the data about 2015 on 10,700 requests for certificates, 9,600 were accepted. So more or less 90% were accepted. In terms of proposal for meter savings, there is instead a very different data, because you can see that 519 proposals have been approved starting from 999, so more or less 60%. That means that a lot of proposals have been rejected for many reasons. So, for example, a proposal didn't contain the requested information, the baseline or additionality were not satisfactory, there were problems, for example, with materiality, and so on. In particular, 2015 has been a tough year for PPPMs because some rules have been changed and some news in terms of materiality have been introduced, and this is the reason why there is this important number of proposals rejected. If we look at the 2016 data, so more recent, you can see that already 8,600 proposals have been received by GSE. Of course, in this case, there are a lot that are still to be validated, but nevertheless, the confrontation, the comparison between the validated proposal and accepted proposal speaks of similar numbers. This is important. It means there is transparency. You can have a look on how things are changing, and of course, this concluded the first verification step. The second verification step is a more detailed verification, always a documental verification. This is carried on according to a sample that is produced by GSE every year and approved by our Ministry of Economic Development. In this case, the proposal are subjected to more important questioning. For example, if you remember, let's say a double-glazed windows have to give, in terms of proposal, only the list of clients and some declaration of conformity. At this point, a lot of other information can be asked to the proponent. For example, the energy certificate of performance of a building, information about the heating system of the cooling system, information about the bills of the related to the component or to installed component, information about, for example, the certificate of performance of the installed technologies, and so on. Of course, this is carried on the sample, not all the proposal, and in the last years, a lot of non-conformity arises from this second step of verification. So one lesson learned is that it is really important to go into details and to ensure that the proposal are good and sound and the technology are really used. And this is especially important for DMET saving, for the DMET saving approach, because for the meter savings approach, of course, you have measured data every year. So at least you are sure that some savings are in place, and you just have to look for non-conformities of other types. For DMET saving files, there is also a problem with the real saving. The third step that can be also done without passing through the second one is on-site verification. Till now, they'll be very limited because, of course, they're costly and time-consuming, but they're also important. And the guidelines of the energy of the white certificate schemes asked that or required that all the projects over 3,000 ton of oil equivalents has to be verified on site, in addition to another sample that is proposed by the GSE. So all this verification process was theoretically in place since the beginning of the scheme 10 years ago, but in practice has really started with more attention with the second and the first step in the last 2-3 years with GSE. So the verification process covers all the aspects of the project data and assures that additionality, materiality, and energy savings are sound. By the way, also additionality is important to monitor because the baseline will change during the years. The technologies that can be those savings can be completely additional in a certain years, can become totally not additional in 2, 3, 5 years, depending on the success that it had and its diffusion over the years. So it is very important to monitor these market developments and to react. For example, in terms of limit saving files, compact fluorescent lamps projects, so a change in the baseline and additionality after 2 years and a half, and then they were completely removed from the eligible projects after 3 years and a half. Because, of course, the additionality change, the diffusion of the compact fluorescent lamps was really fast. And one of the effects of the white certificate scheme was that not only the consumers have the possibility to get for free these lamps from the distributors or the ESCOs, but also that in the malls you will be able to, were able to find new lamps with many forms, performance type, dimension, and so on, that change the possibility for the consumers to buy this kind of lamps, change the cost of the lamps, and so on. Last, the GSE decided to implement a website dedicated to verification with reports for all the existing schemes, managed, of course, by the same agency. And so, in particular, all the renewable energy schemes, incentives for high efficiency cogeneration, and white certificates. And so you can find the global situation in terms of accepted and not accepted, sorry, about the results of the verification process. So this is the total of all the schemes, and you can see that on 3,000 verification, 416 showed some non-conformities. Of course, in that case, money has to be taken back, and there are other issues. We told something about this in the previous webinar. Just 2 slides to conclude. The first one is some news about the Italian schemes. There will be this year the new guidelines with many news, for example, no more tower coefficient to take into account the future savings. Instead, there will be the possibility of consider a time life higher than 5 years to receive the certificates. And the reason for this, the main reason for this, is to ensure that the projects will effectively produce energy saving over all the technical life. Another possibility is the introduction of new methodologies for evaluating the savings, trying to putting together metered savings and simplified procedures. And related to the theme of monitoring and verification, stricter evaluation of the ex-ante consumption, new rules for the responsibilities of the ESCOs and the proponents, and increased controls, both documental, and on-site. To conclude with, it is really difficult to monitor what happens in the energy efficiency schemes, especially if you want to find out reliable data and reliable results, because going on through estimates, it's on the other end quite simple perhaps. And this is linked to the inherent characteristics of the energy savings. Secondly, the use of additionality that is more or less required by the Energy Efficiency Directive, and nevertheless it is used in our scheme, adds a degree of complexity that has to be taken into account, and that of course adds some problems, both in terms of evaluating the savings and verifying what's happened. Third, non-energy benefits are usually not monitored. It is a pity, and both because they can be really important in terms of outcomes, in terms of starting up a process that can be capable of delivering rising energy savings over the years. And secondly, because of course to take into account these benefits, you have to structure your databases in order to consider also information related to these aspects. The verification process at EU level, according to the ESPOL experience, are mainly documental, with a small amount of on-site controls, and in many cases, these documental verification are not very detailed. You have a look at, for example, a UK experience, they go really into details. It is good practice, and it is very important to establish such procedures in order to monitor the effective results of our schemes, and also to put together schemes that can be really different in terms of reliability of the data provided and also the effect on the global target of our member states. And perhaps a consequence and also linked to this issue is the fact that most of the programs lack an advanced measurement and verification protocol, like, for example, IPNVT. This is also an issue, of course, and it means that a lot of work has to be made to ensure that the data we collect are reliable and really in line with energy savings. Last, information technology opens the door for really new approaches to data monitoring and data verification. So it is all the effort has to find out the most suitable solution, the most effective solution, how to use these technologies in order to collect data, analyze them, control them, and share them. And this, of course, is also the main theme of many European projects or proposals that presently are underwriting with the next Horizon 2020 call in mind. So this more or less was the content of the presentation about the Italian White Certificate Scheme. If you have any question for the speakers, please profit for this time by using the question tab. No questions? This is the last webinar for ESPOL, so the last time you will be able to ask questions directly to our experts. Of course, you can contact them directly if you want. I remind you of the proceeding available on the website, and invite you to read all the information that are on our ESPOL website and on the Article 7 EED.eu platform, because really we collected under the ESPOL project a lot of valuable information, and so starting from them you can really find out new ideas to improve your national schemes. And by the way, also the multi project is really interesting. You can get in touch with me or Nina to ask other questions about it because it's really linked to the the monitoring and verification topic. So feel free to contact them. So no questions. Perhaps it's July. Everybody's thinking about the holidays. So have a nice holiday then, and see you in our projects and our activities around Europe or Italy. Feel free to contact us if you have any questions. And thank you for you attending this webinar, and thank you to all the speakers for being with us and contributing to this webinar. See you next time. Bye-bye.